Hey, it's your host, Rick Houston, and I just want to take a minute to introduce you to this brand new book, Petty versus Pearson, by my good friend Mike Hembree. It's got a foreword written by Terry Labonte, and it details the longtime rivalry between two of the greatest drivers NASCAR has ever known, Richard Petty and David Pearson, or depending on your viewpoint, David Pearson and then Richard Petty. It is available this Tuesday, May 20th, from your local Barnes & Noble retail store, or you can pick it up via barnesandnoble.com. Be sure and pick it up because it is a wonderful, wonderful work by my friend Mike. You will love it. All right, well, Mike Hembree, I've enjoyed the conversation so far, but just in general, how did the idea for this new book of yours, how did it come about?
Oh, Rick, it really started as a David Pearson biography. There hadn't been a Pearson book really since 1981 when Jim Hunter did a book on David. Hunter, of course, was a longtime journalist and later a top level lieutenant in the Bill France group, a PR guy for NASCAR, et cetera. He and Pearson were really close, and Jim did a nice job on that book. But of course, a lot happened with David after that. And I have known Pearson since I started covering racing in 1975, and I repeatedly tried to get him to do a book with me over the years, and he just did not want to sit down and do the interviews and spend the time to get to get that done, so that it never really happened. But I kind of kept it in the back of my head as I was doing some other NASCAR books and other NASCAR work, and so I kind of pitched the idea of doing a Pearson book to this publisher and bounced it around for a while, and they came back with the idea, well, why don't we include Richard Petty in it since they were such big rivals and raced together so many times for wins, et cetera. And I thought that was a great idea. I wish I'd thought of it. But so it kind of proceeded from there. Took me a couple of years to write it, but actually it was 50 years kind of involved with
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
material because I talked with both those guys so many times over the years, and fortunately it kept really good files on both.
Once the contract was in hand and everything, what was involved in putting this book together? I mean, how much time were you able to spend with Richard? David had already passed on by that time. How much time did you spend in archives? What was the process of putting the book together?
Well, first I went through uh, my files here at home. I have pretty extensive files from 1975 forward, transcripts of interviews I did with Richard and David and people around them, the Wood brothers, Dale Inman,
Wow.
Maurice Petty, et cetera. Um, and then I went to the archives at Appalachian State University, their stock car racing collection, which is excellent. They have thousands of books and other kinds of files related to NASCAR. For example, Bob Myers, who was a longtime Charlotte News NASCAR guy, he donated all his stuff there, so that helped me. Um, and books, I have a lot of NASCAR books and was able to gather information from some of those. Interviewed Richard specifically for this book three times. Richard always helpful. You know how that works. Um, Dale Inman several times. Some other members of the Petty team over the years. And then I talked with all the three Pearson sons, Ricky and Larry and Eddie. Uh, Ricky mostly, he was kind of the central figure there. David's cousin, a lot of other people who were around the sport during the Petty Pearson years. Went to Nashville and did a long interview with Darrell Waltrip about both guys. And you know how these things work. You've done some books. One interview kind of leads you to another person, and so that took me to some other places and some other people. So I gathered as much stuff as I could find. You know, I could have spent forever on this book, but you kind of got to stop somewhere and actually write.
Richard is such a public figure, and he has been for decades now. Was there anything about his side of the story that surprised you?
Um, Nothing jumped out at me. Um, I guess the surprising thing, in a way, to me and some other people about Richard is when he quit driving. Some of us thought he would kind of remain as a figure in the sport, but I'm not sure any of us thought he would remain as involved as he has been. You know, up until this very moment today. I mean, he's given his whole life to this sport, in effect. And if you don't have a Richard Petty autograph, you're in the minority.
Yeah.
Um,
I think the trick now is to find something that's not signed by Richard Petty.
yeah, it may be. I was at Darlington earlier this year and they had the NASCAR alumni meeting there, and Richard was there in the tent, and Robert Presley, and the three of us were standing around talking, and Richard was getting ready to leave, and Robert said, "Hey, Richard, if you don't mind, can I get a picture with you?" And Robert asked me to shoot the photo, and I told Robert, you know, this is a pretty historic moment because you're the last person who doesn't have a selfie with Richard Petty, which which may be true, but you know, he's always been so accommodating. But I guess the length of his tenure, up now to his age, which I guess is 87, he just keeps going. He's the Energizer Bunny.
Well, he's right now, as we speak, on the Kyle Petty charity ride.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So now on the flip side of that coin is David. And David is one of those just absolutely intriguing characters in the annals of NASCAR because I think he's the exact polar opposite of Richard because Richard has always been so public and so upfront with the media and everything. And not that David didn't do that, but if he could have just driven the race car and then gotten out and gone back to Spartanburg, he would have been perfectly fine. And it just wasn't part of his DNA to do that. Well, I mean, you've known him since 1975. You've known him for 50 years now. What should the public know about David Pearson when it comes to his place in the sport?
Well, here's the primary difference in the two guys, and in a lot of ways they were similar. Essentially, they both were country boys, you know. But Richard grew up in the sport, grew up in the public eye. Basically, he was there every week. Uh, People saw him literally grow up, you know, beside his daddy, who had already made the the family famous. David had none of that. You know, his first link to racing was walking from his house in the Whitney Mill Village near Spartanburg over to the Piedmont Interstate Fairgrounds dirt track and climbing up in a tree and watching the cars run. And he decided on day one, you know, I want to do that. I can do that. Those guys can do it. You know, why can't I do it? So he did not have the quote public unquote background that Richard had, and David, and people have interpreted this wrong. David was very friendly and a talkative guy, but he was basically shy in a lot of ways. You know, he didn't fit in with the hey, how you doing? Let's hang around.
Yeah.
he,
Yeah.
he just wasn't that guy. He did not finish school. He was kind of shy about that aspect of his life, and I think he thought people automatically looked down on people from mill villages who quit high school, and and it it never. I don't think that part of the game really caught up with him, and he talked about that a lot later in his life. That he wished that he had been more of an open, outgoing person, particularly with the media and with the fans who showed up every week. You could depend on Richard Petty hanging around the racetrack for hours after a race, win or lose, signing autographs, and that helped build Richard's career and by the way, the sport. David just was not that person. Um, but I stress again, it's not like he was standoffish or irritable or uncooperative. That was not the case. Once you got to know him, he would give you as good a quote as Richard would. You know, just different, very different backgrounds and very different personalities.
Even though David had passed on by the time you started work on this book, you were able to spend a lot of time around David. You were also able to spend a lot of time around Richard. Individually, what is your best Richard Petty story of your interactions with him over the years? And also, what's your best David Pearson story?
Wow. I don't think we have enough time for those. When I started covering racing in 1975 for the Spartanburg, South Carolina Herald Journal, which of course was David's home paper. The guy who was covering racing for us at that time left the job, and I was called in the next day and told that I was an auto racing writer, never having even been to a race, knew almost nothing about it. So the first race I covered was Atlanta that spring, and knowing that I would have to be dealing a lot with David Pearson for obvious reasons, since we were his paper, as it were. I wandered up to him in the garage somewhat shyly and said, "Hey," I introduced myself, and I'm going to be covering racing for the Spartanburg paper, so I'm going to be bothering you now and then. I wanted to kind of meet up with you and all that. And I said, "Do you have a little bit, some time to talk?" And he said, "Yeah." And so we talked for about 15 minutes, and I asked him some probably really stupid questions, and then he said, "Hey, I got to go get ready for practice. Come back when you have better questions." So, so, so my first encounter with him was pretty memorable. Um, we had some ups and downs over the years, but mostly ups. One of the 2 years that he won the American Driver of the Year award, I went to New York City with him for that banquet for him to receive that award. And after the thing was over, we were standing outside the 21 Club there where the thing was held. Ironically, the 21 Club. And I said, "Hey, how was all this? You know, this is country comes to the city, big time for you." And he said, "Well, I picked up the $10,000 check, ready to go home." Richard, several years back, Richard allowed me to come out to Wyoming, where he owned a cabin there for a number of years, where he and the family went on holidays, particularly at Christmas. It was a whole big Petty family thing. Beautiful place, and stayed there with them for about 3 days, and we went snowmobiling in the mountains, and um, about 10 or 12 of us, I guess, some other guys from the team, and we got up to the top of this mountain and stopped to take a break. And I told Richard there that there's no way that we're going to get lost out in this wilderness, because I've noticed that on the way up the mountain, you were placing some tobacco juice deposits along the way in case we had to have something to follow to get back home. And he kind of enjoyed that, but he was so good at allowing uh, people in the media, or at least some people in the media, to do things like that with him, so you could get a better idea of the Richard Petty behind the scenes guy. Very generous with his time and so forth. So that trip was a highlight for me with Richard.
I guess, I mean, if you started covering the sport in 1975, were you in Daytona for the infamous 76 Daytona 500?
Yes, that was my first Daytona 500.
Well, at least you had something to write about that week.
Yeah, I sort of expected them all to end like that, but that didn't happen.
What do you remember about that race and the aftermath?
Um, I covered that race from the press box. Most people did then. Now most people cover races from the infield media center. Um, the circumstances of that race. I mean, it came down to the last lap between Petty and Pearson, and to the best of my memory, nobody in the press box was sitting down.
Wow.
Clearly it was going to be something big, and the sight lines in that old press box weren't that great. The press box essentially sat on the top of the top row in the grandstand. So guys were standing up, trying to get a better view, and leaning over, looking out toward the fourth turn when they were coming to the fourth turn, and of course then they hit, and at least three guys I remember climbing up on the counter of the press box. I don't know if it was to try to see better just in the excitement of the moment. What crazy thing is happening in front of us here?
Yeah.
I have to get a better look at it. And it was very different then, because now of course you can see replays from 15 different angles repeatedly after a wreck happens. Well, then the TV element was not nearly as big, and you didn't have access to replays, certainly not immediately. So you had to try to see all you could see, And when they crashed, and you really didn't know where to look. They both started spinning out of control, and then you see members of Richard's pit crew come running across that infield grass there to try to push his car, and you're thinking, wait a minute, that's not even legal. They can't do that, but they were doing it anyway. And then you look down, and David Pearson is chugging across the finish line at 30 miles per hour or whatever it was. And one of the things that came to my mind right after that happened was the fact that the NASCAR flagman had the presence of mind to understand what was going on and
Yeah.
actually gave David Pearson the checkered flag. That just in that moment, that was kind of amazing. And then, of course, after the race, chaos ensued, and in the press box, we were all trying to figure out exactly what happened. And fortunately, the guys at the TV network agreed to replay what they had literally over and over and over again on a small TV monitor in the press box, so that we could get a better look at what happened. And then there was some confusion about uh, what Richard said after the race, and in the infield. And then eventually he came upstairs to the press box to sort of explain his view of everything a little better, and that kind of irritated David, because David said, "Hey, wait a minute, the press box is just for the winner." Um, so yeah, it was just incredible, and I know a lot of people like to point to the 1979 Daytona 500 as kind of the biggest finish, but and with all due respect to what happened that day, which also was incredible, I have to stay with 76, because it was, the two giants of the sport in that moment, one turn away from the checkered flag, biggest race of the year, and all that happens. It was, and I've covered a lot of other sports over the years too, and that particular moment stands out to me as the best finish of a sports event that I've personally covered.
In the days and weeks that followed, were you able to sit down with David one on one and get his thoughts on
Not,
what had taken place?
not, no, not in the next few days, but of course, that finish was a topic for the next months on the circuit. So anytime you could pull David or Richard aside and say, "Hey, hey, how you feeling about all this now?" But they cleaned everything up really quickly. I don't know if they actually had a conversation in the next week or whatever, and ironed it all out. But it didn't linger. There were no grudges.
You know,
Two
I,
guys
I
racing.
yeah, I talked to David years after the fact, of course, for the podcast, and when I asked him if there's anything that either one of them could have done to avoid what had happened, I mean, his quote, his response was one of the all time quotes here on the Scene Vault podcast. He said, "Yeah, I could have backed off, but that ain't racing." And that was
Yeah.
David Pearson in a nutshell. It was very succinct, very to the point, but as true as you can possibly get. So that
Yeah.
was David. Now, we've talked about Richard, we talked about David, but when they raced together, and the name of this book is Petty versus Pearson. What was their rivalry? I mean, it wasn't one of hatred. It wasn't one of animosity or anything like that. I think of all the NASCAR rivalries, I think of Petty versus Pearson as one of respect.
Oh yeah, no question. They both repeatedly described the other one as their best competition. Um, Pearson always joked that when people would ask Richard Petty who's the best driver, Petty would almost universally say David Pearson, and Pearson would say, I agree with Richard.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't call them close friends at least during those years, but they became really close later on, particularly after David stopped driving. One of David's and this is addressed in the book. One of David's closest friends in racing was Bobby Isaac. They were very similar people, grew up in the kind of the same kinds of conditions, and just were sort of linked together because of that. And then when Bobby died suddenly of a heart attack, uh, oddly at a racetrack, I think that took the Petty Pearson friendship to kind of another level. They became a lot closer after that. But the '76 wreck and the 1974 Firecracker 400 finish, which was quite controversial. For a while after those races, there was kind of a wall between them, but in both cases that went away quickly. Um, there was no real back and forth either in person or through the media about that. Uh, it was just a different time when there's so much racing that there just wasn't time to hold a grudge like that. You had to drop back and look at things from the bigger perspective and race the next week.
David only ran the full schedule 3 or 4 seasons over the course of his career. If he had run the full schedule more often, what would the NASCAR record book look like now?
It's hard to speculate. A lot of that would have depended upon uh, what team he happened to be with, because as we know, it's not just about the driver. You can have a great driver and a mediocre team, and you're not really going anywhere necessarily. If he had run full time as long as Richard, I'm confident he would have won. I don't know, dozens more races at least, maybe up to 150. Sure, he probably would have won another championship or two, but he didn't really want to do that. And this is kind of odd, despite the fact he was a really good short track racer, probably one of the best 8 or 10 that I've personally ever seen. When he got to the cup level, he didn't really care that much for short tracks, in part because in a lot of cases the short tracks didn't pay as much money, and David was really about the money, really about the money. Um, so when he got hooked up with the Wood brothers, they had sort of the same attitude. Let's go race where the money is. So it fit perfectly. That was the perfect setup for David and for the Wood brothers.
Well, Mike, bottom line, what would you like for our listeners to know about Petty versus Pearson? Not just the book, but the people. What do they need to know?
They need to know that they were certainly two of the top five NASCAR drivers of all time, without question. They need to know that they were different people, but they raced somewhat in the same fashion. Pearson would hang back and race hard at the end. Richard didn't necessarily do that. I think Richard liked to be in the front or near the front if for no other reason than he knew that 43 red and blue car would show up on TV lap after lap after lap. But neither one of them took crazy chances. They raced really smart. David talked often about in the first half of a race, he would sort of scope out the 8 or 10 other guys who might win the race and see which corner they were strong or weak, and he would set it up for later in the race. Hey, that's where I'm going to pass those guys. I think Richard had that same kind of approach. They were both smart drivers as opposed to just aggressively reckless, crazy run, as fast as you can every lap people. One big difference in the two, I think it's possible that Richard broke every bone in his body over his career, several concussions, I'm sure, broke his neck twice, drove with a broken neck at Talladega, many spectacular accidents, flipping, spinning wreck at Daytona and hitting the pit wall at Darlington going 170 or whatever, and everybody thought he was dead. Pearson, very few big wrecks, and one of the stats he prided himself on was he never spent the night in the hospital after a race. Never was never seriously hurt, not even close. His worst wreck was at Bristol. I think it was 1965, and he hit the wall really hard and temporarily knocked him out. And when he came to, he noticed that his shoes had been knocked off. And he said he had always heard if you were in a wreck, either racing or highway or whatever, if your shoes came off, you were dead. So he assumed he was dead for about 3 seconds because his shoes came off, but he really didn't get hurt that day. So, and of course, a lot of that was luck, but also he did not put himself in crazy positions. He figured things out a lap ahead where he wanted to be, and stayed out of the danger zones for most of his career.
All right, Mike, anything else that you would like to get across? Anything at all?
It was good over the closing years to see them together at events, particularly like the NASCAR Hall of Fame. Richard goes in the first year and David the second, and to see them standing side by side up on that stage when they got all the Hall of Fame people together for those group photos and stuff, that brought back a ton of memories to me over the years of seeing them racing 1-2 so many times. It seemed like it almost always came down to them, and you kind of halfway expected that to be the case. Written a number of racing leads before the race was over, in effect, because the last third of the race, you could see the 43 and the 21, and they were going to be there. So you really just waited to see which one of the two was going to win, to finish the story. That's how good they were over that period.